Hi there, welcome to episode 5 of This Is Lit, a podcast where we'll be discussing all things literature. My name is Emily, and joining me today is Prue Baker. How are you going, Prue?
Not too bad. How are you, Emily?
I'm well, thank you. And Sian Clark. Hello, Sian.
Hello.
Keeping up with the theme of the ridiculous introduction. I like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like people enjoy this, so, it's fine.
Got to give the fans what they want, I guess.
Exactly. I am the talent after all.
Yeah, okay.
Sure, yeah.
Moving on.
Let's continue.
All right. I guess if you've tuned into our last few episodes, you'll have heard us discussing The Longest Memory by Fred D. Aguirre and The 7 Stages of Grieving by Wesley Enoch and Deborah Malman. Today is going to be our final episode, which focuses solely on The 7 Stages of Grieving. As of next week, we're going to be giving you a bit of comparison of the two texts. But yeah, before we do that, we're going to be delving into themes from The 7 Stages of Grieving today. So yeah, over to you, Prue.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the themes of power, powerlessness, memory, and trauma. So in terms of power and powerlessness, so throughout the play, I think there's this kind of struggle for power. So the woman and therefore like the Indigenous communities struggle to maintain sort of any semblance of their culture or heritage or any power and, in having a voice in the Australian community. And that is continued or continuing to be denied to them by white oppressors. So the fact that, it started with white settlement and is still being continued today in modern Australia. So throughout the play, we're given or told all these stories, the characters' powerlessness at the hands of these colonizers. So in terms of like discrimination, violence, or oppression. And we see these results of this powerlessness in modern Australia. But I think that though, on the flip side of that, we do see some sort of glimpses of power throughout the play. And I'm not going to go too much into that now because we're going to discuss that later in the episode. Moving on, so really quickly we'll go over just like memory and trauma as well. So once again, just like The Longest Memory, we see this idea of generational trauma, so the trauma that's significant enough that it can be felt or reverberated for generations, so affecting people's descendants, even ones that they haven't met their ancestors, so they haven't met, but they still are feeling this kind of the results or the effect of this trauma that happened generations ago. And the play is very reflective. So there's lots of that memory kind of aspect to it where she's reflecting on events that have happened to her or things that she's been involved in. So for example, her grandmother's funeral, the march, the bridge walk, her brother's story, and her own stories of discrimination and prejudice that are a result of her being Indigenous. So that was just a really quick little summary. Sian, I'll pass it over to you.
Sick. All right. So I will be talking about discrimination and like the feeling of belonging. Obviously, this is a huge theme within seven stages of grieving. Whenever I think about discrimination to do with this story and all of these stories that this play sort of delves into, is the story of Daniel York and how he... York? I feel like I'm not saying that correctly.
I think it's just like
York. Yeah, my bad.
I think it's York.
Yeah, Daniel York, sorry. And how he obviously experienced that discrimination at the hands of all of these, Australian police force people, and all of the discrimination that obviously all the 7 phases of Aboriginal history goes through, and the fact that it's just so awful hearing all these stories, because as I said before, I think in our first episode when we were doing Seven Stages of Grieving that I was like, oh, it's really quite sad because, I am an Australian, but unfortunately I think my education is very limited about these sorts of topics. And I don't know, today I was just kind of thinking about the play as a whole and the text as a whole and thinking about, the themes of discrimination, belonging and healing. And I think I remember I've read something in like last couple of weeks or something, and this play was like described as like a patchwork quilt, essentially. And so what it's meaning is that it's kind of all of these stories like intertwined like together to form kind of, and it's just so interesting because like I remember reading reviews about this play and how originally the Australian public hated it. Originally, like back in the 90s, early 2000s, they hated it. And only now is it becoming sort of popular and kind of revered and stuff like that. And I think it's because Australians, like the Australian public as a whole, have realised that to be able to help the Aboriginals and have the Aboriginal population, Indigenous population heal from this sort of stuff, we have to be able to think about what was the most, like the most terrible things that they have experienced, and seeing and witnessing all these terrible things and witnessing this grief is like a very necessary first step before, we start to heal our country's like, deeply racial, driven wounds, which I thought was really interesting as well. And so when I think about it in that sort of light, I kind of feel like when you're thinking about themes of like discrimination and healing and all that sort of stuff, even when you have, the scenes where, you've got the I think the white colonials, and I think the woman saying like, oh, hey, get out of here, like this isn't your land or this isn't your
the harbour. You're taking up too much space.
Harbour. Yeah. I loved it. And so it was really interesting because you could also say that the fact that that tiny little, episodic scene is also a theme, like has the theme of healing, because it is that really, really necessary first step of encountering this sort of like discrimination and then healing from it. Does that make sense what I'm saying, guys?
Yeah.
I feel like they kind of want to go back and like maybe change it, or like that's how they want to act in a way. I don't know. That's how
And the spatial setting and the temporal setting, like the timing of this is just immense. It goes over hundreds of years. And when we think about themes and stuff like that, I just can't shy away from the fact that, like grieving and discrimination and belonging and healing and all that sort of stuff, it's literally in all of the themes. And I just, like you just have to think of it like a slightly different way. And then that's when you're just kind of like, oh, yeah, no, I understand now. Like, that makes sense. I don't know. I don't know. I found it very cathartic as well. Like, has lots of cathartic power to the play as well, which, again, is obviously quite healing in itself. Yeah. Sorry. Anyway, that's all I have.
I think that what you were just talking about at the end, like, lends into our first focus question for today really quite well.
Well, I'm great, so
okay.
So that's what the listeners want. They just want you to shit on over everything that I say.
Maybe. Anyway, so our first question for today is a question from Prue, and it is: do you think remembering her past trauma and the trauma of her people is always painful for the woman? Okay,
absolutely.
Yeah, so it was funny, like, when I first read this question, I wanted to be like, oh, not always, like, surely there's some good that she can recall from, like, her past and stuff, but, like, I went back through the play, and I think the only, like, positive moment she refers to is at the funeral, where she refers to the joy of being at the funeral and how that's sometimes enough to briefly forget why they're there. But apart from that, which, isn't even really something positive, like the fact that she's with all of her like family and community and stuff because her grandmother has died, like that's still pretty horrible. Aside from that, everything else is just really quite traumatic. And there's nothing positive, I suppose, about what she, like the events that she's sharing with us, which I guess is kind of the point of the play. It's not really, it was kind of written, I guess, to like share obviously the painful experiences that Indigenous people have gone through and everything. So if we look at that purpose, it would kind of be silly for them to be talking about how things weren't that bad, or like, yeah, so I don't know.
Mm.
What did you guys think?
I agree. Sorry, Prue. I just think
No,
the
I
whole
wasn't gonna.
I just think the whole thing, like, do you think remembering her past trauma and the trauma of the people is always painful? I reckon it always will be painful for her, because I think, like, again, it's like that whole healing. I think, like, to be able to, it's, I have no words, like, apart from, like, yes, I think it is. Surely, like, wouldn't it be traumatic for you if this all happened to you and your people? Like,
I think that the one, like, it's not even a silver lining. It's not at all. I think the only maybe, like, positive thing we can say about this is that, like, sharing her grief makes it easier to carry, I suppose. So, like, even though the memories themselves are painful, sharing them kind of eases the pain that she's experiencing. Yeah.
It was like that metaphor that I described, I think, was it last week or something? How, like, grief kind of gets easier over time.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, with the necklace. Yeah. No, I remember. Yeah.
Thank you, Prue. I always knew you were my favourite.
Clearly.
The battle is on.
Yeah.
All right. So where I was getting at with this question is that I think, like, it's it's no it's not a secret that, like, her trauma, and it would be obviously always painful to remember trauma, but I think that, like, a lot of the times in the scene, especially like with the suitcase, that is, like, reflective, like the suitcase is kind of symbolic of that of memories. So sometimes, like, I think we can think about this in terms of ourselves as well, like, memories can hold joy and pain at the same time. So, like, a memory, and it can be even the same thing. So, like, you can remember a memory, or have a memory of, like, something that was even a happy event. So it could be like this memory is a connection for her, and it's a connection to her ancestors. And memory is what is important in terms of, like, Indigenous history. But then it also is that pain because it's a reminder of her suffering, and the experience, or all the suffering that she and the Indigenous community have experienced. So I think, like, throughout the play, she's trying to figure out, like, or like with her suitcase, unpacking it and then repacking it. She's trying to decide, like, what's important. Like, these memories of her ancestors, because she has these memories of her ancestors, but they're painful memories, but she doesn't want to get rid of those memories, because that's her memory, that's her connection. Yeah, that's her connection to her past and her traditions and her heritage and all this stuff. But she wants to be free of this suffering, but that would have to give up, then she would have to give up these painful memories. Yeah, so I think there's, like, this constant, like, she doesn't know what she wants, and she's got to try and figure it out. And I guess that is a process of healing as well. Yeah, so, like, I guess, like, the suitcase symbolic of, like, the joy and the pain of memory, the photographs of the dead, like, she keeps in there, which is, like, partly painful, and also I think, it's also looking at a photograph of a loved one can be joyful as well. But at the same time painful if they've passed. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm trying to get at as well, I guess. Like, obviously all of her trauma would be painful. Maybe I'm trying to go with, is all of her memories, or are all of her memories painful? Maybe that was the question I should have asked. Yeah.
Cool.
No,
thoughts, feelings?
No, I agree with you. Yeah. No,
okay.
Absolutely. Okay. It's very interesting to think about it, I suppose, because I kind of never it never occurred to me that I was like, because I'm always like a black and white person. I'm like, yep, it's either total yes or absolute no. Like with me, there's just very little grey area. But ever since you said that thing about the suitcase and the photographs and how yes, it can be painful to look at somebody and remember them, but it also can be joyful. I've never looked at it that way, so thank you.
That's okay.
Appreciate it. I appreciate you.
There is another reason why Prue is Sean's favourite.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Moving on. Cool. So our next question today is Sean's question, and this question is the Australian problem the fact that we have not been allowing ourselves much emotion for the Aboriginal story? Does it all just kind of get swept under the rug?
Ooh.
I would have to agree with this one straight off the bat. I think, like, thinking about my own education, like, obviously, you know, I think around like grade 5 or 6, we learn all about like the First Fleet. I think I'm pretty sure I learnt something about the Stolen Generation. I don't know when though, but that's obviously something I'd heard about. But I think the issue is, it's like, yeah, you hear about all these events from history, but they don't really talk about how like Indigenous people of today are still affected by them. Yeah, I think that's
there
what's
wasn't
kind of
that,
missing.
Yeah, that extensive discussion of like, well, you can talk about these past events and that's all well and good, but there's like, you need to link this history to modern times, or else people just don't, they just like, they cut themselves off. Like they're just like, well, that's great, you know, that this happened, but that's nothing to do with me.
Yeah, and like, and I think too,
Yeah.
because like you hear people being like, oh, well, yeah, okay, like the First Fleet happened in 1788, 1778.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's okay.
1770 was James Cook.
It's all right. It's
okay. Anyway, sorry. Like you hear about it that, yeah, obviously that happened hundreds of years ago. So I think to some people it's kind of like, oh, but you know, the people of today, Indigenous people of today, weren't even alive back then. So like, how does that affect them now when they didn't live through that? So I think it's more kind of like, it needs to kind of be taught more that like, yeah, the traumas that have affected like people from the past like can still have a flow-on effect now. Like just because you weren't alive at the time doesn't mean that like you're you're not going to be affected by it, I suppose.
It's taught in isolation, or it was taught in isolation. Hopefully it's changed a bit now. The importance of, now we're just spruiking history. Anyway.
God. When I sort of was thinking about this question, I always kind of have to go back to the fact that I just never got really taught about this sort of stuff. And then I remember going through like my school stuff, like my primary school stuff, like a couple of years ago, and I literally did, this is like, again, we have to remember I was probably like 10 years old or something, and I literally did a project in grade 5 or grade 6 or whatever, and it was like, heroes of Australia, and it was Captain James Cook, and I was just like, oh my god, I was just like, holy shit. And I remember looking at this, knowing obviously what I do know now, and there wouldn't be a chance in hell that I would be like, oh my god, like, let's do Captain James Hook as like, oh, he's an Australian hero. No, he's not a hero.
I remember doing an assignment in primary school of like, everyone had an explorer. So I can't even remember mine, but I remember other people's. And it was like Burke and Wills. Mine was John someone. Anyway, we all had like an explorer we had to study. And do a presentation on.
Yeah, and I don't know, and I'm just, anyway, as I was thinking about this question, I just, like, having that as my, you know, grade 5 hero, you know, poster, I'm like, that is just, I'm just, like, of course, this is all swept under the rug. Like, oh my god, it's just, it kind of almost makes me sick because, like, obviously knowing what I know now, and then when I remember I was delivering the lesson about phases of Aboriginal history to my year 12s, and they were just like, oh my god, Miss Clark, I had no idea. And I'm just like, they had some idea about the stolen generation, but like that was it really. They didn't really have any idea about assimilation and how they used to, obviously use these very derogatory terms as to the Aboriginal or Indigenous population, like as half caste and quarter caste and or quadrant or something. Yeah, it was just awful. But yeah, I reckon there's I don't know. I feel like when people think about Indigenous and Aboriginal struggles, I feel like people automatically just go, yep, so I don't really identify with that, so that's not, I won't care about that, or I'm not going to give that too much thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I feel
I think...
Oh, sorry. Just quickly, even thinking back to in grade 5 or 6 when I was learning about the First Fleet sort of stuff, I've just recalled the novel we studied. Right, it was about a convict boy who came to Australia. So it wasn't anything about the perspective of Indigenous Australians. It was more about convicts coming to Australia and what their experience was like on the boats and stuff.
It's laughable. But also it part of it is just oh, I feel sick. How did they? Oh, I don't know. Ugh. How did they? Oh, as a public teacher, I'm just kind of I just don't know how they, the government really got away with this, to be honest. How they have squashed all of this information. But I suppose it's all starting to come out now, or has been coming out now over the past few years. But
still got a long way to go, though, I think.
It requires a lot of people to self-reflect on their own behaviour and question their own ethics and morality. And I think if we then take it also, we need to take responsibility. And I feel people don't want to take responsibility because they feel they didn't actually arrive on the boat on the First Fleet. Then it's not their problem, or it's someone else's problem, because then it's they feel guilty, or but so people don't want to feel guilt and they don't want to feel embarrassed about their role, or I think they're denying their role. We are denying our role, but I think that's why people, if we're looking at why people are sweeping it under the rug, I think it's kind of similar, not similar issues, but other issues that make us reflect on ourselves and be I don't like what your opinion is, because then it makes me feel bad about myself. I can't grow as a person. I refuse to.
Good points.
That's why.
Okay. No, I agree with what you said. Cool. Moving on to our next question. This is my question for today's episode. And I wanted to know, are there any characters within the play that do have power? If so, what kind of power do they have?
Well, I think the grandmother had power. She has power within her own community because she's very respected. She has power because she holds the knowledge of the past and connection with the ancestors. And her photo, even when I read that scene again of her funeral, her photo was on a very commanding position on the wall. So I feel that kind of connotes, or shows her power that she had in her community.
Cool.
I also would think that the woman has some sort of power, merely just because she's given a voice.
That was my point too.
We see her, we don't see her thoughts, we hear her thoughts, emotions, told about her experiences, and I feel she takes back some of the power she might have lost from, at the hands of through discrimination and prejudice. So some of those little elements of humor, I think, is her way to get back some of the power that she's lost. In the scene where she's buying a dress, Murray gets a dress, and she's also then, I think that power is connected to her identity, and so she's rebuilding her own pride in her Aboriginal identity.
Mm.
Despite experiencing, that
Obviously,
racism, discrimination,
injustice.
Yeah.
So I feel like the most, I don't know, I thought whenever I think of power with this text, I always think about it really collectively, not as like one or two characters. So obviously what Prue said about obviously the woman having power, telling these stories, being really obviously that Aboriginal viewpoint, and sharing these stories and stuff like that. But then obviously as I was sort of looking through the play, the other people that have the most power that's displayed within the show is obviously the scene where they're marching and they're marching to protest these deaths in custody. And I feel like this is a really big part in the show that shows that Indigenous Aboriginal Australians can have an opportunity to unite and stand against like this injustice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Even though the protest obviously like it's like I think they call it like it's a terrible protest and it was violent and defiant and everything, but really it was like it wasn't really that at all. But yeah, I found that really powerful as well. And then obviously, the Aboriginal woman, exclaims that, we've been fighting for years and, I guess we can't go back now and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I found that really interesting. And then because I'm a weirdo, I also thought about the opposite of this question, which is like, who is powerless? And I feel like it was it was really interesting to talk about Auntie Grace, because her option, she fled and left. And I just found that really interesting as well, because obviously Auntie Grace wasn't as determined, wasn't as willing as obviously the woman or the grandmother and all the other Aboriginal characters within the show and in our lives obviously, to stay and kind of fight for this. And I found that really interesting as well, because Auntie Grace, she just fled. And she pays the ultimate price for that as well, because she loses her family and she also loses her identity and culture.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, my bad.
No, it's an interesting point, because I don't know, like, with her, because she, like, obviously she did leave her family and everything behind. I didn't really look at that as, like, fleeing, though. I was kind of just like, oh, yep, she, like, met a guy, moved overseas. Like, I didn't really look at it as her, like, deliberately trying to, like, flee the situation. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm weird, because, like, I don't know, if you go off and marry somebody, I feel like if you want to maintain like some form of relationship with your family, you wouldn't go, like, I think it was like 50 years or something that she hadn't been back. So I don't know, as soon as I sort of read that she hadn't been around for 50 years, I'm like, oh well, then she fled that discrimination, and she fled those terrible conditions, and I don't blame her. I'm just I don't know, she's
all
quite
the
powerless.
painful memories.
Yes.
Interesting.
I thought she abandoned her family.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another reason why Prue's my favourite, Emily.
Aww. Here I was trying to earn some brownie points.
Don't put me in the middle. I'm a pacifist.
I'll say something nice to Sian, try and make her sound like she taught me something, but whatever. Okay. Anyway, moving on to our final question for today. This was a really interesting one. I had to actually really think about this one, and that is, yes. Where would you place this text, fiction or non-fiction?
You go first, Emily.
So I ended up arriving at it being somewhere in between. Yeah. So I don't think it fully fits into either category. I actually read somewhere that like Enoch had termed it being faction, so like fact and fiction, like a bit of a mix of both. And I guess like we can't say that it's purely non-fiction, because like it's not really autobiographical in terms of like the woman's experiences. Like it's a collection of personal experiences from other people that they've kind of like that they're expressing like through that one woman. So like it's all based on events and concepts that are fact, but like the way they're expressed, I suppose, makes it fiction.
Yes.
I don't know. What did you guys think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought exactly the same thing.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I think I put this question in, like, I was like, because I just felt like everything we talk about is just so relevant to people's lives. So, like, you know, we're trying really hard to be thoughtful and sensitive and stuff when we talk about stuff. So it's like probably more so than like we would if we were reading a fiction, like an entirely fictional book. If that makes sense.
True.
Possibly. Yeah, so that's why I was like, oh, it just feels, and you know, there's obvious elements of nonfiction in there, like I don't know if it's actually nonfiction, like the report, but the story of Daniel Yock being nonfiction, like that was an actual event that happened, and the marches, the march and the bridge walk are all based off true events. And I also read somewhere that I know where I read it. It was on the website just before I read it. And what am I kidding? And Knox's grandmother, she died in 1993, so just before he wrote the play. So I feel like, you know, he had that. Now I kind of see that connection with the grandmother's death and funeral in the play. Like that is a personal memory or experience that he had. And then on that same website, actually, it says in the Sydney 2014 performance, an old auntie, Aboriginal auntie, who the cast didn't know, she went up on stage and she put her hands around. I knew you would have read it, Sean, so that's why I got in first.
And I was like, I was going to talk about it in the question before, and I was like, nah, better not. keep going. It's so powerful. It's so powerful.
I know. So she put her hands around Deborah Malman, who obviously would have been performing as the woman in that performance, and she sobbed for a whole minute, and like that because somebody at last had borne witness to her life. So like
just so
I just got shivers. Like like these these experiences are just so like people have it's so real, it's so relevant. So it kind of feels like nonfiction sometimes. I think
it felt more like, aside from obviously all the you know, the play imagery and the symbolism and stuff, it felt more nonfiction to me than fiction. Because it's almost like I was reading like diary entries, or like I was listening to somebody's like oral history story, like just, you know, like these tapes being played out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
It just I don't know. To me, it felt like nonfiction. I just felt obviously extremely real. And Prue, when I read that, that I think it was a play review. Sorry. Yeah, it was very powerful. Very, very powerful.
I guess that brings us to our end segment for the day. Prue is actually going to be hosting a game of quote bingo. So, Prue, would you like to explain how this is going to work for us?
Yes. All right. So I feel like I may have partly made this up, or I could not have, and I'm not sure. So don't call me out on this, please. So basically it's like, theme quote bingo, where the players, so hopefully you've already chosen your themes, guys. So you're supposed to choose 3 out of the 6 themes of power, powerlessness, memory, grief, trauma, discrimination, identity, belonging, and healing.
Glorious.
Have you got your 3 themes?
Do we have to tell you our 3 themes?
No, you don't.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I've got my 3.
Me too.
But then what if me and Emily have the same themes?
Well, then you have to be the first at saying bingo.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Is it? Yeah.
All right. So then I'm going to read out quotes, and you need to match the quotes. You can just do that in silence. You can match the quote to the theme, and then when you have identified themes, all the quotes for your chosen themes, that's when you yell bingo. All right. And then we have to, whoever yells bingo the first, then we get to go through and you have to say which themes you had and which quotes were relevant to that theme.
Okay.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think I'm just worried about I might not remember like the whole quote.
No, you can just like summarize. It's fine.
Okay. Good.
Okay. So
Are we
first one.
wait, can I quote Kath and Kim before we move on?
If you need to. What is
Yeah.
it?
All right, go.
Emily, I just want to say game on, Mole. All right, go.
Okay.
Okay. Number one. My children stolen away to a safe place were wrenched from familiar arms and forced to feed upon another tongue. I realize some of these quotes may have like overlapped with like multiple themes, so whatever. We'll figure it out.
Whatever.
This is what happens when you make up your own games. All right. Number 2. You get a lot of attention, special treatment when you're black. All right. Number 3. I'm still black and deadly.
Ooh.
Oh, I think bingo.
All right.
No.
Haha. All right, so the first one about children being taken away from their families, I've linked that one to grief or trauma because that would obviously be very traumatic. Yes.
Yes. I thought it was powerlessness.
Yes, thank you. That was mine. I think powerlessness. I was like, yes.
It fits though, right? I can still use it.
Nah, it fits.
Yeah.
It fits. Yeah, we can't say that's not traumatic. Okay, go.
Yeah, thank you. The second one. Can you read out the second one again? I forgot what it was.
You get a lot of attention, special treatment when you're black.
Yeah, so that one I had for discrimination.
Yeah.
Yep, pretty self-explanatory. Yep.
Mhm.
And then the final one, I had for identity and belonging.
Oh yeah, good. That works better with what I had. I had power. I like that better with identity.
Haha, I won, Sean.
Oh, damn you. It's because I was rude to you and quoted Kath and Kim.
Yep, you brought it upon yourself.
I really did. Oh, well,
I had 12 quotes. Anyway.
Oh, sorry.
I like how Prue probably spent hours like figuring this out, and then within 30 seconds we're like, okay, we're done. Like kids. Like,
yep.
All right.
Yeah, I know.
Do you want to
plan a lesson?
Do you want to? Yeah. When you plan a lesson and none of it works. Do you want to read the rest, and then we'll debate on what theme?
All right. Okay. All right. These are my stories. These are my people's stories. They need to be told.
Obviously, power.
And healing?
Yeah, I had healing. That's okay though.
Damn it.
It's not like a one answer. It's not, yeah, anyway.
Every time I get it wrong now, I'm gonna be like, haha, I win. Keep going.
All right. I think this one's fairly obvious, hopefully. Sometimes I find myself crying in the dark alone. The pain comes in and I cry and cry until I can't feel anymore.
Grief. Trauma.
Grief. I think grief. Yeah.
Grief, yeah.
Yeah. All right. One more.
Okay, one more.
Another washed his face in my blood. Together they chained my feet.
Powerlessness?
Yeah, I've had powerlessness.
So good.
Prue actually shared the quotes with me in advance, so that's why I won. Just kidding.
I knew it.
I'm like playing you off against each other.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yes. Fight for my approval.
Cool. Well, that wraps up episode 5. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Next week, we are going to begin comparing the 7 stages of grieving with the longest memory. And I think we're going to start off by comparing some of the characters. So you have that to look forward to next week. See you all next week. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye.